Hello everyone, welcome to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. Today in this session we are going to have a discussion on the newspaper analysis for 22nd of April 2024. So let's begin with the list of articles first. So today for detailed analysis we have all these articles. One related to the new guidelines for organ donation. Then there are three articles which are related to our environment, and this is in the perspective of the World Earth Day that we have today. And then after that we have sobering assessment related to the IMF report that we have discussed in yesterday's news analysis as well as on 19th as well. So these are the ones which are here for detailed analysis. And then after that we have two articles from the prelims perspective. One about Australia in its report saying India is a top tier partner, and then something about the mpox virus, something that we have in the last page, that is the science page. So let's begin with the analysis of our first article, and this is about unique ID must be generated for organ donation. Now in this context what we have seen is that the Union Health Ministry of India, it has introduced a significant update to the organ transplant process by mandating the use of unique identifier called as the NOTO ID. Alright, it is supposed to be called as the NOTO ID. Now this is something which is very crucial for any kind of organ donation, both for the donors and for the recipients in all the organ transplants. Alright, so both for donors and the recipients. So for both of them this unique ID will be very crucial. So this is basically what we have seen in this new notification or guideline. Now this applies whether the donor is living or deceased that is. So meaning that the directive basically has required the hospitals to generate this identifier via the National Organ and Tissue Transplant Organization or NOTO. So that's why it becomes very crucial from this perspective, and that is the reason why NOTO, because we are talking about the National Organ and Tissue Transplant Organization. Now this measure basically becomes a part of a very broad effort to try and curb the potential commercial dealings in organs, particularly those transactions that involve foreign nationals. Now this initiative, that's why it comes in the wake of rising concerns about the malpractices and an increase in the number of organ transplants that are involving foreigners. Now in this context what we have seen is that the ministry has also issued order to all the states and union territories to ensure that there are stricter regulations and transparency being maintained in any kind of organ donation. Now this NOTO ID, that's why it becomes very crucial for the allocation of organs, especially in case of deceased donor transplants, and it must be issued within the 48 hours after following the transplant which is involving a living donor. Now, so that's why for living donor transplants it must be generated within 48 hours, and for deceased donor transplants the NOTO ID is immediately necessary. Now that's why in this particular scenario what we see is that this system aims to try and facilitate better tracking and regulation of organ transplants across the country. So that's why it becomes very crucial here, that it becomes very important for us so that we have a better tracking and regulation of the organ transplants. So that's why this becomes very crucial from this perspective. What we have seen additionally is that the ministry has also emphasized the need for regular inspections of hospitals authorized to perform organ transplants. And that's why these inspections, they are to be conducted by the appropriate state authorities to try and assess the quality of transplantation and the post-operative care of the donors and recipients as well, and overall you can say the outcome of the procedure altogether. So that's why state authorities, they are become very crucial, because they would do regular on-site inspections of the hospitals performing the transplant to monitor the quality and the outcomes of the surgeries and post-operative care. Now, in this context, what we also see is that if there are any violations of the Transplantation of Human Organs and Tissues Act of 1994 and any of the associated rules with it, then they are to be very rigorously investigated, and that's why any kind of potential penalties, including the suspension of the registration of the hospitals which have been found in engaging in the illegal transplant activities. So that's why overall, when we look at this entire scenario, we understand that this framework has been designed in a manner to enhance the ethical standards and the effectiveness of the organ transplant system in India. So that's why this becomes a very crucial aspect of it, because we have seen and we have been discussing this in our previous news analysis as well, that how India has been looking towards all the issues related to organ transplants, because we have seen that there have been many cases where Indian nationals have been deprived of the organ transplants, and foreigners have been given a benefit here, because we have seen that because they are the ones who pay higher amounts, they are willing to pay higher amounts. So that's why we see that there are these kind of activities which are not perfectly legal in this scenario, and some of the hospitals, they have been earning a lot of money out of these kind of organ transplants which are being done to the foreigners instead of the deserving Indian nationals in all these cases. So that's why we see that now these kind of updates and these kind of guidelines have been brought forward by the government of India. So it's a very welcome step, you would say, in this context of organ transplant. Now let's move on to our next article. And here we are talking about preparing India for water stress, climate resilience. So we have this article on your editorial page today. Now in today's newspaper, there are 5 articles that I can count, 5 editorials that I can count related to World Earth Day. But out of those 5, there are 3 that I read which are crucial, and these are the 3 which we are going to discuss, because these are the 3 which are bringing forward very important points with regard to our environment and sustainability of the future. So the first article here is preparing India for water stress, climate resilience. Now, this article basically discusses the critical challenges and the strategies for India in managing the water resources given the climate change, particularly emphasizing the interconnectedness of water with all the other sectors such as agriculture and energy. So that's why remember that this is where we are discussing how water is related to 2 very important areas of energy and agriculture. So this is what this article largely is about, and there are certain points which we need to understand from the perspective of this situation. Now the very first thing that we need to understand is that when it comes to the Indian Meteorological Department, the Indian Meteorological Department has forecasted a hotter summer and a longer heat wave from April to June. And this is something that underscores the need for preparedness against water stress. Now, overall, what we have seen is that the traditional approach of treating such climate events as temporary and addressing them with disaster relief is something that has become inadequate, and it's not enough anymore. So that's why we have seen that they have forecasted that there will be a hotter summer and longer heat wave from April to June, and that's why in this particular scenario, it's not enough for us to treat this kind of an approach in a traditional manner, where we think that okay, fine, this time it's going to be hotter summer, so next couple of months we have to do something and this temporary phase will pass. But unfortunately, today we are living in a day where we see that climate change becomes a very crucial part of our being, unfortunately. And that's why many of these problems that we are facing right now, or probably we are about to face in these coming months, they are problems which are not going to be temporary in nature. They probably will become a part and parcel of how we have to respond every single time, every single year. So that's why we have to build strategies, we have to build our entire, you can say, resilience, understanding the water stress that is about to be looming here. Now that's why what we have seen is that there has been a call for shift in perspective from reactive measures to proactive understanding and management of the chronic climate risks. And that's why you can say that in a manner, when we look at something like an Earth Day, we have to take this as an event, and we have to take this, you can say, as one of the days where we pledge that we are going to change our perspectives and we are going to look into the problems where we are right now and where we need to head. Now, in this context, when it comes to India's water and demography, you'll see that for India, this becomes very, very crucial to understand, because we have a lot of water stress. So, for example, if you look at the data, we support 18% of the global population, and we have only 4% of world's fresh water. Only 4% of world's fresh water supporting 18% of the global population. And that's why India faces a very significant challenge with pollution of rivers, or maybe groundwater, the depreciation of groundwater that we have seen, the overuse of groundwater, the pollution of groundwater, and at the same time, the kind of extreme events, extreme climate events that we have seen in the past few years, whether it is about droughts, whether it is about floods, whether it is about cyclones. We have seen that even flash floods in Uttarakhand and Himachal, we have seen that these kind of events have been rising. The number of these occurrences have been rising. So that's why this is where we need to understand the problems and we need to have a permanent solution towards it. And especially we have to understand the problems that we having just 4% of the freshwater resources while trying to support 18% of the global population is a big problem for India. And that's why overall we have to understand that there are economic implications as well. So that's why, despite when you look at the kinds of investments that have happened in India in disaster preparedness, India faces both sudden and slow onset of climate change. And that's why this will be something that will be demanding more than just a seasonal response. So that's why we have to understand that overall, when it comes to water's role in economy, it is huge, because it is related to our food, it is related to our agriculture, it is related to our energy systems and overall the Indian economy. So that's why we cannot neglect the role that water plays altogether in maintaining the health of Indian economy. And that's why for us to be prepared becomes very, very crucial in this context. And that's why when you take it one step further and talk about agriculture, we know that India has a very heavy reliance on agriculture. We have approximately not less than 45% of India's population which is employed in agriculture, correct? And when it comes to Indian agriculture is deeply affected by climate variability. We know how much we are dependent, for example, on irrigation, correct? We are so much dependent on irrigation. So for irrigation, the kind of water requirements that we have, the crops that we go, for example, we do grow a lot of paddy. Now, I'm very sure that you all know that paddy needs very heavy amounts of water. And in the absence of rainfall, in the absence of proper amount of water availability for agriculture, we do not know how exactly can we sustain agriculture. So that's why the changes in monsoon patterns and the kind of heavy rainfall sometimes also, they also disrupt farming activities. And that's why we need to understand the need for climate resilience in case of agriculture also. So that's why all these points, they become very, very crucial for us to understand in the context of India. So one part is agriculture. The second part, very, very important, is energy. Now, we know that today we have been trying to push for green energy or clean energy. So whether it is about solar energy, wind energy, hydroelectricity, green hydrogen, so there are all these different aspects where we have been trying to build our clean energy or renewable energy sector. Now, in this context also, especially when we include areas like, or energy sources like green hydrogen and hydroelectricity, we see that they are the ones which rely heavily on water resources, and that's why these sectors, these are the sectors where water availability becomes very, very crucial, because if we need a sustainable growth from these energy sectors, it's not going to be easy for India unless we build a proper strategy for how India is going to use its water for energy transition as well. So that's why we have to understand that they have to be understood well by India, and that's why we have to understand the kind of urgent need that we have for a comprehensive water management. So that's why with the increase in water related disasters, the kind of changes that we have seen in the climate patterns, this is what underscores the need for India to make a very comprehensive water management strategy. Now, what kind of strategies? What are the kinds of strategies that we can have here in case of water? Now, the very first thing is that we have to recognize the two very, very important aspects of the water requirements. One with regards to food or agriculture, and second with regard to energy, so that we can better integrate water with food and agriculture. And that's why it becomes very, very crucial for us to plan and implement the requirement for water that we have in these areas. Then at the same time, we have to also understand the role of various different aspects or very different strategies and programs and policies that have been brought forward by the government of India. For example, the National Water Mission and Amrut 2.0. These are the kinds of programs that are trying to aim to improve the water efficiency. But again, at the same time, it's not going to be very easy, because we need to have a very solid baseline data to understand the progress effectively, to understand from where are we going, how much do we need to do, what are the requirements versus what are we able to fulfill right now. We have to understand all these aspects better. And then after that, we also have to look at the various different types of financial tools for adaptation. For example, the commitments towards climate change. The way right now, when we look at the commitments towards climate adaptation in water sector, they are very less, and that's why there has to be a push for more sustainable investment in the way we can manage water in various different sectors, whether it is energy or agriculture. So that's why when we look at what the article also talks about, and in general what we know about water, what we see is that the systematic change that we have seen with water strategy is slow, and that's why it is starting with very that's why we need very coherent policies, improving data for water saving, and also innovating the financial instruments. These are the things that can pave the way for water secure and climate resilient economy in India. So that's why there are especially these kind of things that we have to understand, that how can we make coherent policies, how can we have improved data for water saving, how can we have innovative financial instruments that can help in making a better strategy for water use in India. Now, another article that we have here is Empower the Guardians of the Earth, Do Not Rob Them. Now, in this context, when we are looking at this article basically talks about the fact that when we look at certain areas, and it has taken the example of the Little Nicobar, that the 7 small islands of Nicobar, the small Little Nicobar especially, in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, we see that through an inhabited, although they are inhabited officially, they are historically and culturally significant to the indigenous people who have been living there. The southern Nicobarese people, the Paiute. Now, they traditionally use these islands, particularly the Moray and the Menkel Islands, which are used for spiritual practices and subsistence. Now, just understand this, that when it comes to the use, what we basically see is that when it comes to the inhabited islands near the Little Nicobar, we know that there are the indigenous people for whom these islands are culturally and spiritually significant. Now overall what we have seen is that, especially when it comes to the Meroe people and the Menkal people, we have seen that for them, they have been using them for resources and spiritual practices and managing them sustainably through traditional guardianship. Now overall what we have seen is that these islands, they are protected and managed by the communities, community elders, and they are designated caretakers who uphold the sustainability practices, and they are deeply influenced by their spiritual beliefs. Now in May 2022, the local administration, they proposed the establishment of 3 wildlife sanctuaries on these islands, including the Meroe and the Menkal. Now in this case, when it comes to this context, we see that they did not consult or acknowledge the indigenous community's rights and the claims that they have in these islands. Now in this context, what we see is that these communities' protests and concerns, they have been expressed through official channels, and the administration proceeds with their plans. They have designated an extensive area as the protected zones in the last year, that is last year in October 2022. Now the selection of these islands for conservation was also criticized as arbitrary, and that is where we see that a lot of claims that were there from the officials, the ecological value claims, such as the minimal presence of endemic the megapod birds, or the uncertain status of the coral diversity. All these were used in doing or making this move, and that's why this move has been viewed as a cover for the environmental and social repercussions of a major developmental project at a nearby bay that is supposed to happen, and this is where we are talking about the Galathea Bay. Now, so that's why we have to understand that this is where that's why we have seen that there have been criticisms here over the arbitrary selection of these islands for conservation, highlighting the minimal presence of megapod birds on Menchel and questionable coral diversity on Meroe. Now, in this particular scenario, that's why we have seen that we know that there are developmental projects that are supposed to happen at the Galathea Bay near the Great Nicobar. You might know that we have the Galathea Bay, and that is where we see that certain projects are supposed to happen, and these are projects that also pose very severe threats to the biodiversity and the indigenous population's way of life as well. And that's why this narrative basically reveals a broader global issue where indigenous rights are very often sidelined by the governmental and the corporate interests under the guise of conservation and development. And that's why when it comes to these indigenous groups, who are the most effective guardians of their territories, they are frequently displaced without any kind of fair consideration, and this is something that jeopardizes their heritage and sustainability practices that have been preserving the biodiversity for centuries. Now this situation, that's why this situation, it reflects that a worldwide pattern where indigenous rights are very often overridden by the developmental and conservation efforts. Now in this context, what we also have to understand that when it comes to this, the situation is a situation like this, it also calls for a re-evaluation of the conservation approaches to try and genuinely include something or include at least the respect for the indigenous stewardship. And that is where we need to also ensure that environmental protection and cultural preservation, they go hand in hand. So and this is a problem that we have seen not only in areas, in these kind of areas, but we have seen such kind of a problem in a lot of other tribal areas as well. In a lot of tribal areas, we have seen this kind of a problem, and not only in India. I'm not talking only specifically in the context of India. We have seen this happen worldwide. Wherever we have these kind of areas or these kind of indigenous populations who have been preserving their natural surroundings and biodiversity around them, and many of these areas, they also worship the flora and fauna of this region. They also worship the nature, and by doing that in a manner, they become the guardians and they start preserving the naturality of these areas. But unfortunately what happens is that in the name of development, in the name of infrastructure, and many a times that's why it is also argued that when we use the term development, when we use the word development, development often is seen in the context of infrastructure. A lot of times development is seen in the context of infrastructure, and we start believing, or we have a kind of a notion that okay, this way of life is a developed way of life, this way of life is what everybody else should have. Or we also think that okay, these are the people who are not getting the advantages of the value generated by so-called development. But we have to understand that many of the tribes which have been living for centuries in a certain, and they have been maintaining a certain way of life, works for them, and it has been working for them and their surroundings. They have conserved themselves, their beliefs, their practices, their culture. At the same time, they have been taking care of the biodiversity around them. So when we think of development in that way, many a times we have to change our notion, the way we are thinking of what development means. What development could be for you and me may not be development for something else. So that's somebody else. So that's why at times things can be subjective, and we have to understand this subjectivity wherever it comes in, and we have to understand the role of the local communities, where we have to understand that the environmental protection, all right, environmental protection and cultural preservation, they have to go hand in hand. So that's why we have to take this aspect of philosophy of climate change, climate sustainability in this context as well. Now coming to the next article, again an editorial that we have on page number 7, the challenges of renewable energy. Now in what we saw was that in a recent speech, the UN Climate Change Executive Secretary Simon Stale, he emphasized the critical nature of the next 2 years for the planetary survival, and he highlighted the urgency of addressing the intertwined challenges of climate change, development, and sustainability. Now this speech, it basically had shed light on the complex dynamics of the current development models that are driving the unsustainable greenhouse gas emissions, and the struggle to align these models with equitable climate change mitigation strategies. Now, so that's why when it comes to understanding of this, what we know is that India has been aiming for a net zero greenhouse gas emission by 2070, right? So India's ambition to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2070 is largely focused on transitioning large scale renewable energy, particularly solar parks. However, the implications of this transition for the local and the national development and the sustainability outcomes, they remain ambiguous. India currently has 214 square kilometers of land under solar parks, but may need up to 75,000 square kilometers, about half the size of, if you consider the state of Tamil Nadu, half the size of the state would be required to just meet the net zero targets that we have. So that's why this is basically, currently we are using 214 and we might have to go up to 75,000 square kilometers to meet these targets. The local impacts of these solar parks will vary. For example, when we look at certain examples here, in Rajasthan, if you look at the Bhadla the farmers, they have lost the sacred lands, and the pastoralists, they basically have been facing reduced grazing land, and that is something that has also sparked protests for the land rights and recognizing them under the Forest Rights Act. So that's why we have seen that farmers basically have been losing their sacred lands, and that's why they have been protesting under the Forest Rights Act. So that's why they have been talking about this, that when it comes to this, the land rights have to be recognized under the Forest Rights Act. And on the other hand, what we have seen in Karnataka, so in Pavagada, what we have seen is that in case of Karnataka, the farmers basically have benefited from a steady income by leasing their drought-stricken land for solar energy production. And though issues like water security and economic disparities, they have persisted, but we have seen that they actually have benefited by leasing this land which was drought-stricken. So when we look at the problems overall nationally, what we see is that the expansion of the solar parks, they poses challenges, including the competition for natural resources, for example land and water, or potential impact on food security and biodiversity losses. So there are all these concerns that we have nationally. The ecological repercussions are especially significant in the natural systems, for example like deserts, where the disruptions can lead to broader environmental and climate impacts. So that's why what we have to understand is that we need a more equitable approach for renewable energy development. And this is something that suggests that solar parks could be community owned also, so that we can enhance the local benefits. And at the same time, we can also look for reforms in the environmental and social impact assessments. For example, having improved legal and regulatory frameworks to protect the local interests and ensure fair compensation for the land use. So for example, when it comes to environmental impact assessment, so if you know about environmental impact assessment, this is a kind of assessment that is done wherever or whenever any large infrastructure project has to be taken up in an area which is natural, which has a lot of flora and fauna, etc., or which has a kind of biodiversity that we want to preserve. Now, largely, for example, let's say when you have a hydroelectricity power plant, when a dam has to be constructed, so wherever the dam is being constructed, maybe a lot of flora and fauna will be submerged. So we do see there, we do the environmental impact assessment to understand that are we losing out on any important species of plants and animals? Is there any critically endangered plants and animal species which are living in these areas? Are we going to destroy the habitats for these kind of flora and fauna? So these kind of assessments are done. But the environmental assessment, impact assessment rules in India, they actually have left out the renewable energy projects, meaning that let's say if a hydroelectricity power plant is to be constructed, then this will be done. Any large infrastructure project is supposed to be taken, this impact assessment will be done. But let's say something related to solar energy, something related to wind energy, something related to green hydrogen, if these are the kinds of projects for which you are acquiring land as government, then environmental impact assessment is not required. So then in that case what happens is many a times it can lead to certain issues, and that is the context of what we are seeing in Rajasthan. At the same time, when we discuss the cases of the Great Indian Bustard, that how we know that some of them have lost lives because of the high power transmission lines running because of the large wind farms and solar farms that we have. So many a times that's why we have to understand the perspective of that even in case of renewable energy also, maybe an assessment is required, whether it is environmental impact assessment or social impact assessment. We need to do all this to ensure that the local communities, they are not at a disadvantage. So that's why it is that's why we have to understand that we have to explore community-owned renewable energy projects to enhance the local economic and environmental benefits. Now, at the same time, this article also mentions something called as agrivoltaics. Now, agrivoltaics basically is something that combines solar energy generation with agriculture. Now, in this context, so that's why it is basically integration of agriculture with solar panel installation to maximize the land use and support the local communities. Now, in this context, for example, let's say one of the problems that we have with solar energy is that the solar panels that we lay down, the solar panels are laid down horizontally, correct? Solar panels are laid down horizontally on land. So what then happens is that you need a lot of land, correct? You need a lot of land to support the entire solar park that you are trying to build. Instead of that, we can use innovative technologies. So for example, innovative technologies like solar tree. Technologies like solar tree, something that has been advocated by CSIR. And what happens in case of a solar tree is that instead of laying down the all these solar panels horizontally, what you would do is that you would have a vertical structure, and the solar panels basically will be placed like branches of tree on this. So what then happens is that instead of using a huge portion of land, you will be able to do vertical installations and use the same land with much more effectivity. You'll be able to use it with much more effectiveness, and that's why this is something that will be very, very crucial in this context. I'm very sorry that I completely forgot to insert the picture of solar tree here, which has been advocated by CSIR. I would suggest that you just go and Google it once so that you will get the proper understanding of what it is. It is just like a tree where you have the branches where the solar panels will be put up. I had taken the picture, but unfortunately I forgot to insert the picture here in this slide. So please go and just do a basic image search of solar tree and you will understand what kind of figure I am talking about. So in this context, that's why we have to understand that how exactly we can have sustainable methods that allow for simultaneous energy production and agricultural activities as well. And that's why it will benefit the local communities economically and environmentally at the same time. So that's why this becomes very, very crucial. And in summary, what we can say is that while India's shift towards renewable energy, particularly solar energy, is a cornerstone of its climate strategy, it is something that necessitates a nuanced approach that considers varied local and national impacts as well. And that's why this also includes, let's say, reassessing land and the resource use policies, exploring the innovative and community focused energy models, and integrating these efforts with broader developmental objectives to ensure the transition is both sustainable and equitable at the same time. So that's why this is something that we need to do in this context. Now coming to the next article we have on page number 6, sobering assessment. Now what we know is that the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, has recently updated its growth forecast for the global economy in 2024 to 3.2%, and this is an increase from the earlier projection of 2.9% that they had done in October. So this is basically the context in which we are talking about. So we have seen that the global forecast has been changed or updated to 3.2%, and in case of last October, that is October 2023, it was 2.9%. Now this upward revision, it reflects the global economy's unexpected resilience in facing severe challenges, including the major central bank interest rates hikes that have happened, which are aimed at stabilizing the prices. And much of this sustained growth momentum is also credited to the advanced economies, particularly to the US, which has played a very crucial role in driving this demand. And despite this positive trend, IMF has also identified a very concerning increase in the economic disparity, particularly between the wealthier nations and the many of the developing countries. So what we call as global north and the global south. And that's why the global south or the developing countries, they are experiencing a downward revision in their growth projections. And that's why we have seen that there have been increase in inflation in some of these countries as well. So that's why, for example, when we look at regions like parts of Africa, Latin America, the Pacific and the Asian nations, specifically we have seen that these countries, they have been severely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has led to a significant economic contraction compared to the pre-pandemic levels. Furthermore, what we have seen is that these countries, they are now grappling with high debt service burdens as well, that are significantly limiting their governmental spending on very essential public services such as education or healthcare or food security. So that's why we have seen that there are all these issues that we have seen, that there is a growing economic gap that has been highlighted between the wealthier nations and the developing countries, and we have seen that lower growth and higher inflation has been projected for the poorer countries. So especially that's why we have seen that they actually have been facing a lot of these challenges. And so that's why in education, in healthcare, in ensuring food security, these are the areas where many of these countries, they have been facing a lot of difficulty. And in a related assessment, the World Bank also had highlighted that for the first time in this century, half of the world's 75 poorest countries are seeing the income gap with the richest nations to be widening. And this is something that also signals a historic reversal in the developmental progress that we were seeing. So that's why they have described it as a historic reversal in the developmental progress. And the World Bank's chief economist, he also had pointed out that these countries which have almost a quarter of world's population, and 90% of them have been facing problems related to hunger or problems related to malnutrition, and they are potentially in the midst of what he has mentioned as a lost decade. So what he has said is that this is potentially a lost decade for many of these countries. So that's why we see that 90% of the poorest 75 countries, they have been facing problems related to hunger and malnutrition. And that's why we have seen this kind of a problem. And while these nations basically are overlooked by most of the international community, they represent a very crucial part of the global population whose economy or the economic potential needs to be harnessed to achieve a universal peace and prosperity for the world. So that's why we have to understand the kind of issues that we have seen, and that's why he also urged the wealthier nations to provide financial support to these poorest of the countries. And that is where the examples have been taken from South Korea, China and India, who have been transitioning from being borrowers to now becoming donors. So that's why this is very, very crucial to understand that in this context, when it comes to countries like India or China or South Korea, they have transitioned from being low interest loan recipients to becoming the donors to the World Bank's International Development Association. So that's why we have to understand that this is something that has been highlighted, and this is related to the discussion that we had done on 21st April and also the discussion that we had done on 19th April. So this, you can say in a manner, it is a continued discussion from the previous two discussions that we had done related to the same report. Alright, so there are various facets of this discussion that we are doing every day. Now let's come to the articles related to your prelims examination. The first article that we have is related to the mpox virus. and this says mpox virus uses a genomic accordion to evolve and infect humans. Now overall, see, we'll not go into the details of this article because this article is pretty scientific in nature and not something that we expect to come in your examination. But the information which is not given in the article but related to the article is more important. So let's go there and do that discussion first. So we are talking about the mpox virus. Alright, we are talking about the mpox virus, which formerly was known as the monkeypox virus. So this mpox virus, which we also popularly knew as monkeypox virus, has been renamed. And this is a disease which is caused by the infection of a virus, which is called as the monkeypox virus. Now this virus basically is a part of the same family as the virus that causes smallpox. And that's why people with mpox, they often will get a rash along with some of the other symptoms. So let's just understand that we are talking about mpox, which basically was known as monkeypox, and it is something that is from the same family or same, let me write, same virus family as smallpox. Same virus family as smallpox. Now in this context, what we see is that a rash that develops, the rash will go through several stages, including the scabs before healing. So what we see is that it will start with a small rash, and then after that it might become bigger rash, and then it can become scabs, and this is what it would look like, these kind of scabs. I'm sorry for the visuals, but you need to know that this is what happens ultimately. So before healing, we might see that these kind of several stages of rashes would develop. Now in case of mpox basically, also just to remember that mpox is not related to chickenpox. Not related to chickenpox. Alright, you might confuse, but just know that it is not related to chickenpox, and it is a zoonotic disease, meaning that it can be spread between animals and people, and it is said to be endemic in certain parts of the world, and that is where they have been found regularly in parts of Central and Western Africa. So just remember one more thing, that it is a zoonotic disease. It is a zoonotic disease where we see that it can be spread between animals and people. So where is it endemic? We have seen that they have been endemic in these parts of the world. Now the virus that causes mpox, it has been found in these parts of the world, and that is where we see that Central and West African areas is where they often are found. And small rodents, monkeys and other mammals that live in these areas, they are the ones which become the primary carriers. So just remember that the small rodents, all right. Then apart from that, monkeys and other mammals. So small rodents, monkeys and some of the other mammals. They are the ones which actually can be carriers of these diseases. Now in this context, what we have seen is that the mpox virus, or what was called as monkeypox virus, it was discovered back in 1958 when there were two outbreaks that had occurred in the colonies of monkeys which were kept for research. A spillover happened from there, and because of that it spread. And despite being named as monkeypox originally, the source of these diseases, they still remain unknown. So do not confuse that monkeys have been the primary source always. We do not know what the primary source is. Scientists suspect that African rodents and non-human primates, they might be the harbors for this virus, and they might be the ones to infect people. And the first human case of mpox virus was recorded back in 1970, where we saw that now, where we have the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was also known as Zaire back then. That is where we had found it. Now, in this, so what we see in the recent years is that in 2022, the mpox virus had spread around the world, and before that, the cases of mpox in other places were very rare, and usually they were linked to travel, or they were linked to animals being imported from the regions where mpox is endemic. So the World Health Organization, the WHO, had renamed the disease in 2022 to follow a modern guideline for naming the illness. And those guidelines, basically, they recommend that the disease names should avoid offending cultural, social, national, regional, or any professional or ethnic groups. And that's why, to minimize the unnecessary negative impact or effect that can happen on tourism or animal welfare or trade or travel. So that's why we see that the regionality which are associated with the names, they are now not used. In case of COVID-19 also we have seen this, correct? That although we know that the outbreak happened in China, in the region of Wuhan, and that's why many also called it as Wuhan virus, including the former president of the US, Donald Trump, calling it as Wuhan virus. But now what we see is that WHO does not want to include these kind of regionality anymore in any kind of namings that they do, so that they do not have any negative impact on any culture, any national, regional or ethnic groups altogether. So that is what we see. And overall, just to add to this information, there are two types of monkeypox virus. One is clade 1 endemic and clade 2. So clade 1 is something that causes more severe illness and can lead to deaths, and some outbreaks have even killed up to 10% of the people who get sick, although more recent outbreaks, they have had very low death rates. And clade 1 is something that is endemic to the Central African area. Alright, so this is the area where you have clade 1. This is the area where you have clade 1. So just remember that when it comes to clade 1 is more severe. Alright, it is more severe and has led to 10%, up to 10% of mortality or deaths. So this is what we have seen with clade 1. And then when it comes to clade 2, this is the type that caused the global outbreak that began in 2022. The infections from clade 2 mpox are less severe, and more than 99.9% of the people would survive. And clade 2 is something that is endemic to the Western Africa. Alright, so when it comes to clade 2 basically is endemic to Western Africa, and clade 2 was the one that caused global outbreak in 2022. Alright, and this is something which is far less severe. 99.9% of those infected survive. Alright, 99.9% of those infected, they would survive. So this is what we see as these are the two types of mpox virus that we have. And overall, when it comes to mpox virus, so just understand that when it comes to the symptoms of the virus, there are all these symptoms that can be there. You can just pause and look at all these symptoms. How it spreads, there are various different ways in which it can spread. So just you can have a look at all this. You can just pause the video maybe and look at all the different ways in which it can spread. So this is what it is about the mpox virus. Now coming to the last article for the day, Australia to deepen ties with top tier partner India. Now, what we have seen is that Australia has come out with a new national defense strategy. And the new national defense strategy of Australia, which was released this month in April 2024, it identifies India as a top tier security partner. And that's why it underscores the importance of the comprehensive strategic partnership between India and Australia. Now, the partnership basically tries to aim to enhance the practical cooperation that contributes to the stability of Indo-Pacific region. And that's why the strategy tries to emphasize Australia's commitment to deepen the complexity and the scope of its defense and defense cooperation with India. And this includes expansion of bilateral and multilateral collaborations, defense industry collaborations, information sharing, etc. So that's why just remember that the new national defense strategy, this has been brought by Australia. It says that India is a top tier partner of Australia and they are going to deepen the relations with India in various different aspects. So for example, in bilateral and multilateral cooperation, then at the same time they would also look towards defense, collaborating in defense and also in various different industries. So additionally, what we see is that the government of Australia, it also recognizes India's critical role in regional dynamics and also had expressed a continuous intent to seek collaboration opportunities with India. And that's why we see that Australia has also highlighted India's pivotal position in all these strategic efforts. And the strategy further also outlines Australia's plan to strengthen its defense relationships not only with India but also across all the key regions such as Southeast Asia, the Pacific, Indian Ocean region and the North Asian regions. So that's why when it comes to this national defense strategy, it also has mentioned an increased risk of conflict in areas including those bordering India. And it has highlighted the strategic challenges in this region as well. And the comprehensive approach, it also reflects Australia's broader security concerns and its commitments towards maintaining the regional peace and stability altogether. So this is where we are with regard to the National Defense Strategy of 2024 brought by Australia. Now, towards the end, let's look at the two mains questions for the day. The first question is, with the onset of hotter summers and longer heat waves, discuss the challenges and strategies for ensuring water security in India. Examine the importance of integrating water management with agriculture and energy sectors to build a climate resilient economy. So this is what we discussed in the first article, the first editorial that we discussed, the second article rather that we discussed today, where we see that there have been a prediction of hotter summers and winters that has been done by Indian Meteorological Department. And then we have to understand the problems and the strategies that we need in ensuring. So there are various aspects of what we have discussed, plus there are a lot of things that you might know. You know that all these can be done and all these are the strategies that can be used. So just think of it, write on it, and if you can, submit those answers in the comments. And then the second question, evaluate the underlying factors contributing to the disparities between economic growth trajectories of advanced economies and those of the developing countries, and discuss the potential policy measures that could be adopted by international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank to mitigate these disparities. So we have to understand two aspects. In the introduction, you will talk about what the IMF report says and how we see that there is a widening gap between the economies, the developed economies versus the developing and the underdeveloped economies, and the role that COVID-19 pandemic has played, the role that the international geopolitics has played in it, and you have to broadly discuss all these aspects. And then the strategies, that what are the way outs, what are the things that can be done by the international bodies, plus how the international bodies are not the only ones that can help, but also all the wealthier nations who can also be the donors, who can also help in establishing a better economy, because otherwise the kind of reversal that we have seen in the development of these economies, that can be very bad for the global economy in the future. So that's why these are the points that you should discuss in the second question. So with this, we come to the end of today's session. I hope that this session has been fruitful for you. Please go back, revise everything, and if you like our initiatives, please do subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for being here.